Hey guys, Art Appreciation. This is going to be your last video. Hopefully you all are working on those questions in regards to Byzantine, early Christian art, as well as the Middle Ages, due early next week. Remember, next Tuesday we'll have a virtual classroom, a Zoom setting, where we'll be going over any questions that you might have in regards to the final. All right, so tune in at 9:30 next Tuesday. So today's last video, is going to be on the Renaissance. All right, so this is what's following the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And the Renaissance literally means rebirth. It literally means like the rebirth of antiquity. Now, what we mean by antiquity is dating all the way back to the classical Greek and Roman periods, all right, and how that was derivative of the Egyptian period. So we're looking at antiquity going back to those classical periods. Okay, so that's what Renaissance means, rebirth. And if you remember, in the classical Roman, we start to see elements of perspective coming into play. All right, an interest in implied space, spatial depth. And then with the Greeks, there was an idealism, right? And humans were elevated to the level of gods, and gods were degraded or became diminutive in nature and became more human-like in their depictions. So what we're going to see in the Renaissance is a rebirth of antiquity coming from those two classical periods, an emphasis on humanism, meaning that the human is the center, right? And also an interest in greater technical prowess, so to speak, whenever it comes to creating a composition, meaning, like I said, with the Romans, you started to see perspective in the paintings. We're going to start to see that perspective come back, right, and be highly advanced and become really an emphasis of of technical awareness and control in the composition or in the painting, in the paintings in particular. There's also another major technical advancement that's happening during this time, which starts in what's called the Northern Renaissance, which followed the early and High Renaissance. Our Northern Renaissance started around the time of the High Renaissance. Okay, so just real quick, the early Renaissance starts in Italy, also known as the Southern Renaissance, and it continues and develops and becomes what's known as the High Renaissance in Italy. All right, so Italy's the epicenter. And then during that transition into, now it just naturally happens. There's not just suddenly one day everybody wakes up and is like, oh, today's a High Renaissance. All right, it's a natural, organic development from the early Renaissance up to the High Renaissance. And during that High Renaissance period, north of Italy in Europe, Western Europe in particular, Flanders and such, that's when the Northern Renaissance starts. And you'll see a little difference between the Northern Renaissance and the Southern or Italian Renaissance, where in the Italian Renaissance is where you see the early and High Renaissance. Because you'll see a little more interest in nature in the Northern Renaissance and the environment, and less of that outside natural environment in the Southern Renaissance. In the Southern Renaissance, it's very much about architecture, it's very much about perspective, it's very much about humans controlling the environment. And the best way that humans can control an environment is by building structures that allow them to govern a little better, versus trying to govern out in the middle of the wilderness. But in the Northern Renaissance, there's an appreciation for nature in the wilderness still, and you start to see a little bit more of that come into the compositions. But in the Northern Renaissance, that's when oil paints start, this use of oil paints. We saw earlier Van Eyck, and Van Eyck's pieces, his paintings are oil. And those oil paintings were picked up by the Southern Renaissance painters like Leonardo da Vinci. And it just became a surge and a wave of technical advancement, both in the Northern and in the Southern. So, again, just be aware that the oil painting actually started in the North, and then the Italian Renaissance picked up on it, and then that's when it became what's known as the High Renaissance. Okay, so we'll see in the Northern Van Eyck, as well as moving into, later on. Well, I won't get into that right now, but you'll see it begin there and then trickle its way down to the south. So the use of oil paint is now just beginning. All right, it was not a prevalent, it was not used in the past, and now it's being used. Okay. Also, we're going to see a heightened use of realism. All right, and realism is coming from the use of light as well as space and mass. So, obviously, with your sculptures that we're going to see, the mass is implied, right? It's either open or closed form with the mass. But to get implied mass in the paintings, that's going to be highly developed during this period, as well as the use of light and shadow, and also perspective in space. So you'll see a little more aerial perspective in the Northern Renaissance, and certainly the linear and horizontal perspective in the Southern Renaissance, also known as the Italian Renaissance, with the early and high Renaissance being in Italy. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little synopsis of what's going on whenever it comes to the Renaissance. Okay, now also just to give a point of context on where this surge is suddenly coming from. Oh yeah, one last thing before I talk about the surge is the artist become, again, this plays into the humanism. The artist becomes the individual. So the individual starts to get acclaim for their artistry, versus as you're looking through the PowerPoint with the early Christianity art, early Christian art, as well as Byzantine and the Middle Ages in particular. All of the artists are anonymous. Who they are does not matter, because what they're doing is the work of God in the Middle Ages, so who they are individually is insignificant. Versus the Renaissance, it's moving away from that God-centered mentality into human-centered mentality, and now the individual artists are more important. That's why we have come to know four major artists during the Renaissance that all of you probably know: Michelangelo, Leonardo, right? Raphael, and Donatello. They're all Renaissance artists. So their individuality becomes heightened, and it becomes the focus of the artistry. All right, versus before in the Middle Ages, who you were did not matter. You were just an artisan for the hand of God, doing the work to keep everybody, focused on biblical awareness and art as a form of worship. Okay, so we're moving away from that functioning art as a form of worship. We're moving more into self-expression, but also patronage. All right, so the patronage during this time is going to be huge, and we're shifting away from the patronage just coming from the Catholic Church, which the papacy is a big part of the Renaissance development, especially in Italy. The Pope being in Rome, right? So a lot of money is coming from the Catholic Church and the Pope and the papacy, and that money is going to the individual artists to develop artwork for the Catholic Church. But also, and this goes back into what I was going to say, is there are patrons and merchants that are making a lot of money. Now, where are they making this money? They're making this money from the West, from the new land known as America. So during this time, right, 1400s, 1500s, there is a discovery of America. And all the wealth in America and also other areas in the world are being taken from those lands and brought back to Europe. And that's where all this money is coming from. So where there's this huge surplus of money, these would be like multi-billion trillionaires in comparison to where we are now. These would be like the CEOs of Amazon and the Bill Gates of the Renaissance, the Steve Jobs of the Renaissance, all these big names that are that have been multi-billionaires and millionaires. These are who these merchants were. So they could compete against the Catholic Church because they were making in those times, millions and billions of dollars, but it wasn't actually millions and billions, it was far less, like 100,000, in money then is like millions and millions of dollars now, if not more. So the merchants start to make their way, or these patrons start to make their way into the paintings. It's not just about religious connotation, it's now about how these merchants become part of the competition, so to speak, to make the art. So again, just context, where this surge of money suddenly comes from is the the conquests of the West. So going through the Atlantic Ocean and discovering new land and bringing the wealth and value of those areas back to Europe, and then that wealth increases the level of art making. All right, money is going into the art making process. Okay, so let's start looking at some things. We're gonna go. Let me get my PowerPoint going here. All right. So the first one we're going to look at is Bondonet's Lamentation, and I have this in here because you remember we're coming out of the Middle Ages where everything was very art as worship, so functioning for Christianity in particular. Okay, so obviously, in the early Renaissance, we're going to be transitioning out of a lot of really biblical tales and working more towards that emphasis on the classical Greek and Roman tales, all right? So that rebirth of antiquity. So in looking at this, you can start to see that there is drapery. It's starting to become more realistic. There's shading. There's hints of value. There is some kind of atmospheric perspective being developed with all the figures stacked behind one another and lamenting over the fallen Christ figure. And then also, I mentioned the drapery. It's becoming organic, meaning that it's becoming more realistic. But also notice that there's more emphasis on the individuals and the disciples that are following Christ, and Jesus is not in the center of the composition. Okay, he's kind of to the side and off towards the front left of the composition. So he's no longer the center of focus. And that's where the shift of the Renaissance is going, is no longer, like I said, God-centered mentality or focus. It's more about human-centered focus. So it's more, when you look at the composition, you see all the detail and technical aspects of the painting, and not so, and then and Jesus's figure is kind of secondary in relation to the primary technical advances that they're trying to develop during this early Renaissance period. All right, the subject matter, the biblical subject matter, is still there, but it's more about how do we create light, space, and mass in these compositions. That's what becomes, and realism. How do we start to develop more realism in these compositions? Okay, So again, in the early Renaissance, the use of the patrons that are making lots of money from mercantile trade is, as well as discovery of the New World, are starting to make their way into the art competition, right? So we're going to look at Masaccio's The Holy Trinity, and it says here the first painting based on systematic use of linear perspective. So we're seeing that linear perspective that we saw in the classical Roman period coming back, all right? So it was lost after the Roman Empire fell, and it went into the Byzantine, the early Christian Byzantine and Middle Ages, and now it's being recovered, okay? And the vanishing point is below the base of the cross. Okay, so again, this is a biblical portrayal, but there's something that's really interesting about Masaccio's The Holy Trinity. When you look at it, is you can see the realism, you can see the drapery, you can see the linear perspective, almost like it's something out of a mixture of the classical Roman and classical Greek period, all right? So you got that heavy drapery that you would see in the classical Greek, and then you see the perspective starting to develop, the linear horizontal perspective coming from the Roman period, all right? So again, that vanishing point is underneath the feet of the Jesus's feet on the cross there. Okay, so everything's leading back to that perspective. It's a low perspective. But one thing are the individuals in the front, in the red and in the blue, that are outside of the alcove where Jesus is with the saintly individuals. Those are the patrons that paid to have this painted. So they have the money to be included in the painting. So it shows not only their tie with antiquity, but also they have the money to start being included. All right, so they become part of this biblical tale, so to speak, during the Renaissance because they got the gold, they got the monies to make sure that they're seen as these patrons. Okay, so they're called wealth. So it says the wealth of merchants enabled competition in the form of art patronage. Okay, so and they literally had themselves painted in this scene during the Holy Trinity, that they consider themselves so important that they wanted themselves painted in this biblical pastime. Okay, then if you look, there's a popularity in the nude subject. So essentially taking the nature of the human nature down to its bare minimum, which is its natural nude form. And where else did we see that? We saw that in the classical Greek period. Okay, so again, that emphasis on humanism and showing that kind of the bareness of the human body is a reflection of its significance in the world. All right. So they're going back to that classical Greek idealism of the human form. In the Romans, they were clothed often. All right. They were clothed. But in the Greeks, it was completely exposed. So in Donatello, right, this is our first main Renaissance artist. This is his version of David. And we'll also look at a version of David by Michelangelo, which most of you have probably seen. So real quick, this is the first life-size freestanding nude statue since ancient Roman times. Okay, so we haven't seen any nude freestanding statue since the Roman period. And why is that? Because there's no emphasis on nudity during the early Christian art, the Byzantine or the Middle Ages. Okay, that's gone out the window. Everything was covered in clothing. It was all about the proper representation of biblical pastimes and Jesus and God, and then the idea of nudity is contradictory to that. So that was removed. But now we're seeing that rebirth of antiquity, where the Greeks and some of the Romans even used it too, but mostly the Greeks used the nudity, start to reemerge. Okay, it is a biblical figure though, so it's taking these biblical pastimes and absorbing them with this sense of antiquity. All right, so taking the ideas of the Greeks and the Romans, but then using the biblical stories that are coming out of the Middle Ages. Okay, but one thing that when you're looking at Figure 17.3, which is David by Donatello, is notice that serpentine pattern in the body. All right, that serpentine pattern is what? It's called the contrapposto. And that contrapposto stance was seen in the classical Greek period. Okay? So they're bringing back that classical Greek stance. All right. So David is not clothed. He's not covered up. He's completely exposed. Again, exposing the importance of humanism, the importance of the human body being derivative of this cerebral focus on human-centered activities. Okay. And then we have in the early Renaissance Botticelli's Birth of Venus. This is the first large mythological painting since antiquity. So again, we haven't seen a mythological tale since the Greek and Roman time. All right, remember the Greek and Romans were polytheistic, meaning they believed in multiple gods, versus monotheism, which was the center of belief, obviously, during the early Christian art as well as Byzantine and Middle Ages. So now there's a rediscovery in that. And real quick, technically speaking, with the visual art, is that it's decorative and flat background, which makes the figures appear to be in relief. They look like they're coming off of the surface. And if you look at the old relief friezes in the Greek period, you have a flat background that can be decorative in nature, but then the figures come off of that back marble and they're in relief, right? They're carved in relief. So the paintings are starting to look like those old friezes that you would see on the Parthenon, for example. So it says here the pagan goddess in a modest role previously reserved for Mary. So Mary was the modest figure that we saw during the Middle Ages, and now they're reborning, so to speak, these pagan goddesses, or this pagan goddess, as the center of modesty and reservation that we see in the Birth of Venus, Venus being the pagan goddess. Okay, so take a look at that and just see how it's decorative in the background. It makes the figures stand out more, very much like the relief friezes that we saw in the Parthenon. Okay, and we're going back to old pagan mythology and polytheistic mythology that we saw, during antiquity, during the classical Greek and Roman periods. Then we get into the High Renaissance, which is 1490 to 1530, and this is in Florence, Rome, and Venice. And of course, the three names that you're going to remember the most are Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Okay, these are the three main ones. So Leonardo da Vinci, the art and science as two means. So obviously, Leonardo was very much interested in doing combining the arts and the sciences. All right, he didn't separate them; he would combine them. Right, which was a very Renaissance approach, is not separating art from science or science from art. They go hand in hand. Okay. For example, in ceramics, we make art, but we also focus on chemistry and geology. Geology, knowing where the clay comes from; chemistry, how we apply glazes. So it's really important to understand both concepts, both disciplines. So Leonardo would very much focus on anatomy. He was really interested in anatomy. So there's a great sketch of the fetus in the womb, which we looked at earlier in the semester when we were talking about drawing, or around midterm when we were talking about drawing. And the fetus in the womb. So doing all of these intricate drawings in preparation, right, for his paintings. So using drawing as a sketch or an avenue or conduit to get to the overall painting. Plus all the annotations that he has next to the drawing. So he is looking at creating some kind of journal, right? It's a journal, not just a sketchbook. And so that means that he actually observed a fetus in the womb whenever he was drawing this empirically. That means that the sciences were developing in a way to create these dissectionals and such with people, and then during those dissectionals, he's drawing, he's sketching what is being observed. So obviously, there's no ultra scans or anything like that available during this time. So there had to be a physical presence for him to be able to draw this, which just talks about the medical advancements that they were developing during the Renaissance as well. Okay, and then you all know the Mona Lisa and her intriguing expressions. So one thing about Leonardo da Vinci is with his paintings is two things. One is he really focused on fairly common individuals. He was not interested in any well-known celebrities, and celebrities at that time would be like, patrons of the church, or, the Pope, or anybody in a high position. He was interested in more of the common individual. And we saw that in the classical Roman period, an emphasis on the common individual. All right, the everyday person. Because of the public works of the Roman Empire, it was very much about the everyday person. You had your emperor, that was always, tied to divinity somehow, but then everybody else was heavily focused on as well. So Leonardo da Vinci is starting to bring that fairly common individuality out in his work. That's why the Mona Lisa is just a common person, right? It's just a common everyday person, just like we saw in ancient Rome. It says here in humanism, an individual could be worthy of a portrait. So anybody, you, me, just regular John Doe, Jane Doe individuals would be worthy of a portrait. Okay, and Da Vinci focused on that with the Mona Lisa. And one last thing with Da Vinci is what's called sfumato, which is blurring of the lines. So the contour lines are not drawn out, they're blurred, and they're smoky. That's what sfumato means. It means smoky. And if you look at anything long enough, you can see that there is a smoky kind of blurred line between an object and its background. It's not just really sharp and linear. There's a smokiness to it, and he was essentially showing that depiction of reality. That when we look at something, everything just kind of blurs together on the hard edges, so to speak, if you look at it long enough. Or if you even look past it quickly, you can see everything just kind of blurs together. And he's focusing on that blurred line from one object to the next. Okay, and you can really see it in the Mona Lisa. And then you can also see it in the Last Supper, where he has a lot of hidden geometry, which strengthens the symbolism. Okay, it's a one-point linear perspective. Okay, so again, that horizontal and linear perspective is starting to come back, and that linear perspective goes back to the vanishing point, which is where Jesus's halo would be. All right, so the aura around Jesus's head in the center would be the vanishing point, and everything architecturally is going back towards that vanishing point. All right. And his body itself creates a triangle, which discusses order and structure. So there's a lot of geometric diagrams, or right in the forehead actually is where the vanishing point is, almost like a third eye, so to speak, or where the mind is, the cerebral area, which is where the halo or effulgence would glow from the head if one is enlightened, like Jesus. So it's kind of a focus on that enlightenment being the vanishing point of the composition, and how it comes out from the center of his forehead, and radiates out into this series of triangles. So take a look at the diagram and see how those triangles are developed throughout the composition. All right. Well, let me get a drink of water real quick. I told you this video was going to be pretty long. I never wanted to try to redo videos or anything, because when you come into the classroom, I don't get to just redo something if I slip on something. So I just want to make sure that we make these videos as true and honest as possible. So Michelangelo and his David, you can look at his David, and there's a little bit of information there that breaks down the depiction of his David. And that there's a sense of anxiety and readiness for conflict. So he had to change the proportions to kind of give a sense of that feeling. If you look back at that information, it says changes in proportion and depiction of inner feeling. Okay? So the proportions are exaggerated or abstracted to give it a sense of that inner feeling, but he also needed to abstract the hands in particular, because this piece by David, or this piece by Michelangelo, David, was supposed to go up high in the temple or high up in the altar, but it never was, and it's placed down low, so that's why the hands look so big. So if the sculpture was up high, being 14 feet tall, high up in the air, if the hands are actually in proportion to the body, then they will seem small at a distance up high. But with them being large, it would visually, optically look like they were the same size as the body. So he did that for mechanical reasons, technical reasons, but he also did it to emote a sense of anxiety in preparation for conflict, especially if you look at his eyes. You can see he's focused and he's ready to take on Goliath. He's got a stone ready in his hand and a sling in the other. So, and there's that contrapposto again, all right? That focus on the serpentine S-like curve that you see during the classical Greek period. Then the Sistine Chapel, Pope Julius II ordered Michelangelo to take on this commission. All right, there's the Genesis scene, the creation of Adam, which is the image that we see, and this is the expression of God as idealized, rational man with interest in humans. So this again is the humanism aspect, where even God approves this humanism, so to speak, is what Michelangelo is depicting in the creation of Adam. It says here the prophets and Sibley's and Old Testament figures on the other levels, and the Last Judgment on the end wall above the altar. Okay, so the images that we have, there's one that shows everything done. Again, this was fresco, so the wet plaster was put down. It's set up just a little bit. Then the pigment was rubbed into the plaster, painted into the plaster, and then it solidifies and creates this limestone crystalline surface that preserves it, and then also gives it this radiance about it whenever the light shines on it. Okay, so all biblical scenes done, and the patron was Pope Julius II, so coming from the Catholic Church. Michelangelo became the patron saint, or a chief architect and a patron painter of the Catholic Church during this time. All right, there's a diagram that shows everywhere everything that was done on the Sistine Chapel, and then there's the creation of Adam, which shows where essentially this rational and idealized godlike figure is approving the humanistic aspect of Adam. All right, like, okay, you be the center of this world. I'm giving you the baton, so to speak. Go run with it. So that's kind of the idea of the humanism. Again, being reborn from the classical Greek and Roman period, the Greek period in particular. Now, one thing I do want to mention is I mentioned chief architect. Another area was Egypt, where the pharaohs had chief architects. And the pharaohs were considered these divine-like rulers that had one foot in the one foot in divinity and one foot in material world. And so they would use that terminology, chief architect. And so the Catholic Church was also using that terminology, chief architect, whenever it came to Michelangelo for the papacy. All right. Yeah, so let's move on from Michelangelo. Let's quickly get into Raphael, and this will be the end of the High Renaissance. Then we'll move up into the Northern Renaissance. So Raphael was the third major artist of the High Renaissance. Again, there were 4 total during the Renaissance. Just think of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right? Michelangelo, Raphael, Donatello. Donatello was in the early Renaissance, and then Leonardo. So Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael were in the High Renaissance, and then Donatello was in the early Renaissance. So Raphael focused on warmth and gentleness. That's what was emphasized. Work most frequently embodied the clarity and balance of the period. So we saw the School of Athens, right? We've seen that with the linear perspective. I've asked you a few questions about the School of Athens. So go back and take a look at that. And that you see again is a complex composition with symmetrical subgroups. So with Plato and Aristotle being the center. But one thing I want to look at is Paul preaching at Athens. And this was commissioned by Pope Leo X. And then the reasoning is that it transmits religious truth. Okay, so again, functioning as, when obviously your patron is the Catholic Church, art will be functioning for worship purposes. So that's what this is. And if you look at it closely, you can see some individuals are praising him, some are unsure and they're listening, some seem like they're detesting what he's saying. So there's like this range of emotions. Not like in before in the Middle Ages or during a time where it was very much God-centered, everybody would be like, yes, 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 I'm listening to your preaching. But this is showing more of the humanistic aspects of being not agnostic, but more, I guess, more questioning and kind of trying to be more rational about coming to a conclusion. Not saying yes or no, more about, well, maybe, let me think about that. And then you can see that in the emotions coming from Paul preaching at Athens. All right, so this is coming towards the end of the high Renaissance. Okay, then the Renaissance in Northern Europe. Okay, so we talked about Jan van Eyck of Flanders. Okay, and this during the Northern European Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance, it's there's a preoccupation with depicting life in the real world. Okay, so again, life that's happening on a daily basis, right, is becoming heavily influenced during this time. And like it says here, Van Eyck wanted the first to use oil as a painting medium, which allows detail and depth to be believable, and then brilliance and transparency of color, which was previously unattainable. Like you saw with the frescoes during the High Renaissance that we just looked at with Michelangelo, is that the transparency in color is not as rich and attainable as you would with the oil-based material that you see with Van Eyck. So we're looking at the Amolfini portrait, which is a significant symbolic object which indicates fidelity, fertility in a marriage, and accurate figures in space. All right, so there's the fertility, obviously. These are patrons, so these are individuals that have a lot of money, that have done a lot of mercantile explorations, and so their money is going towards these paintings, right? So they're being, so where is fidelity? Fidelity is the dog. If you think of the word Fido, right? Um, so Fido comes from the word fidelity. So the little dog there in the center is Fido, right? Fidelity. And showing that there's no adulterous actions, they're unified, they're connected. She has that sense of reservation and meekness, like we saw with the birth of Venus with Botticelli. And before that, it was Mother Mary during the Middle Ages. So that meekness has transferred, and that reservation has transferred from the Mother Mary spiritual figure to the pagan goddess of Venus during the birth of Venus, and then now to this self portrait by Van Eyck in the everyday wife of the husband. So it's trickling down to the most human aspect of civilization, which is that of family. Okay. One thing I do want to, two things I want to mention is look at the high degree of drapery that is present, what's called organic drapery, and how realistic it is, and how realistic it can be with the use of oil paint versus the other paints, the fresco paints that were used in the early Renaissance. And then also the use of the reflection in the background. Okay, the reflection in the background is showing the complete atmosphere of that room, and it's making the painting larger than life. It's making it larger than the frontal. It gives it a posterior or a backdrop that is reflecting. And if I'm not mistaken, in the reflection, you don't see the painter. All right, even though he's standing there painting them, you just see the couple standing together. Don't quote me on that. We'll have to do some research. But it expands the room, which happens in the Baroque period, which follows the Renaissance that we're not going to be getting into. But everything becomes expansive and larger than life, and this is the precursor to all of that, the use of the mirrors being painted. And again, you can get that really soft detail and texture with the use of the oil paints versus before you really couldn't get this kind of detail in the past. Okay. Then there's Dürer, who's German, and further developed practice of combining symbolism with realism. So from the night, death, and the devil, which we looked at before for printmaking, right? So these were etchings and dry points that were done, and it combines Christian symbols with familiar subjects. Okay, so there's the Italian techniques and beliefs, increasing belief in the artist as a creative individual. So if you look at his self-portrait with a fur coat, excuse me, there is the painting of Dürer. So what I want you to do for Dürer is go back to the printmaking PowerPoint and look at what it says, the night, death, and the devil, and go take a look at it again. Okay. And then let's talk about Bruegel real quick. Lives and surroundings of common people with rich landscapes. So this is it's Hunters in the Snow. So this is what I was talking about with with the Northern Renaissance showing more of the environment or the nature outside. So it's starting in the Northern Renaissance. It's starting to show all the sense of control and the sense of order and the sense of kind of rebirth of human activities, like you saw with the classical Roman, but focusing more on the outside, all right? So the Northern Renaissance painters are very much interested in environment and how the humans relate to that environment. They're still in control of the environment. It's not affecting them. They're still getting things done, and humans are the center of activity, but it doesn't diminutive. What's the diminutive? Yes, it doesn't make nature diminutive as much as we saw in the Italian Southern Renaissance, where it was very diminutive. Okay, so Hunters in the Snow is a good example of that, and it's also a good example of a combination of linear and atmospheric perspective. So all the architecture is moving back in one angle all right? But it's layered in this aerial perspective as well, with all these activities that are going on in the Hunters in the Snow. All right. So what I'll do is I'll have you be responsible for the late Renaissance and mannerisms in Italy. Okay. So you just have a few slides that you need to look through for late Renaissance and mannerism, right? So that'll be your responsibility, and you will see some questions in regards to that for your final. Okay. So I hope this was helpful. I know the Renaissance is it's a very long period. It's a very crucial part of history. It's a turning point. It's a turning point in art history. It's where everything starts to shift forward more towards the individual as we progress from the 1500s to modern day. And we have a really great Art History 1 and Art History 2 class that can be taken online. And Professor Tara Karim teaches it. And every fall we teach Art History 1, and every spring we teach Art History 2. And Art History 2 really focuses on post-Renaissance all the way up to contemporary art. And then Art History 1 focuses on what we're just briefly touching on, from the Paleolithic period all the way up to the Renaissance and Baroque. Okay, the Renaissance. So keep that in mind if you're interested in any further studies in art history. And I'll go on and sign off here, and I'll be talking with you all on Tuesday. Okay? Take good care. Bye-bye.